He didn't say anything. Not when I was angry, not when I cried, not even when I begged for a reaction. He just stood there, silent, still, as if the storm I was throwing at him wasn't his to fight. And maybe it wasn't, but back then I thought love meant trying to fix, to soothe, to explain. And he didn't. That silence, it didn't feel cold. It felt deliberate, like he had already decided that my chaos wasn't his responsibility. I remember thinking, why won't you fight for me? I wanted fireworks, passion, apologies, something to prove I mattered. But he looked at me the way a mountain might look at a raging storm, unmoved, grounded, unbothered. That moment broke something in me, but not the way I feared. It didn't make me hate him. It made me question myself. Why did I need his reaction to feel real? Why did silence feel like rejection, when maybe it was clarity? Most men try, they chase, they fix, they apologize even when they don't understand. But he didn't. He never did anything just to make me feel better. At first, I thought it was emotional neglect. Later, I realized it was integrity. He wouldn't lie to comfort me. He wouldn't fake a feeling just to ease my insecurity. He wasn't cruel, he was consistent. And that was something I wasn't ready for. I had never met a man like that before. I threw tests at him, silent treatments, emotional traps, even tears, and he passed them all by not playing. He refused to be manipulated by emotions, not mine, not his own. That was maddening at first. It felt like losing control, but deep down, it also felt honest. For once, I wasn't the one choosing when the fire started or stopped. He had his own thermostat, and it never rose just because I screamed. He was calm, too calm. There was a night I sat across from him, furious. I said, "You don't even care if I'm happy, do you?" He looked at me, not with anger, not with defense, just presence. "Your happiness is yours," he said. I laughed, bitter, confused. But something about the way he said it, like a truth I'd been avoiding, made me stop. In that moment, I saw it. He wasn't trying to hurt me. He was trying not to own me. For days after that, I walked around with a storm inside me. I kept replaying his words, hoping they would change if I heard them enough. "Your happiness is yours." It sounded so detached, like he was removing himself from us. But maybe that's what scared me. He never saw us as a melting of identities. I wanted someone who'd dissolve into my emotions, feel what I felt, react when I cracked. He wouldn't. And I called it distance, but now I know it was discipline. I told my friends, "He's emotionally unavailable." They nodded, reassured me, offered clicks like "you deserve more effort." But none of them had sat in front of him, in that silence that felt like a mirror. He didn't ignore me. He didn't dismiss me. He simply didn't perform. And that kind of stillness is terrifying when you're used to chaos. He wasn't cold, he was sovereign. He wasn't heartless, he just refused to hand his emotional thermostat over to someone else. There's a kind of man who fixes your feelings because he can't stand the weight of them. He'll rush to reassure you, not out of strength, but out of fear of being rejected, misunderstood, or unloved. But this man, he let the tension sit. He didn't run from my disappointment. He didn't rush to clean up the mess. He gave me the space to sit with it, to own it. And that space felt brutal, because I was used to using emotion as leverage. And with him, it didn't work. I remember another time when I cried in front of him and expected him to fold. I expected arms around me, hurried words of comfort, but he just sat beside me, quiet, present, solid, not absent, not distant, just unshaken. It made me feel both abandoned and deeply seen. Because in that moment, I realized he wasn't trying to rescue me, he was honoring me. He believed I could hold my own pain. And instead of making it smaller for me, he gave me the space to grow into it. That kind of presence, it's rare. Most men overcompensate. They think showing up means fixing, pleasing, proving. He didn't. He showed up by not disappearing into my feelings. He stayed himself stoic. Still, watching me not with apathy, but with a kind of deep, unwavering trust that I could handle my own storms. And that unnerved me. Because if he wasn't responsible for my happiness, then who was? I started to realize I'd been chasing comfort, not connection. And he knew that all along. Most of the men before him were predictable. I knew which words to use to make them soften, which tears would draw them back, which silences would make them chase. It was like playing a song I'd mastered long ago. But he didn't dance to that tune. With him, none of it worked. Not because he didn't care, but because he was immune to manipulation. He didn't flinch when I pulled away. He didn't chase when I went quiet. It was as if he saw through the drama and refused to be cast in my story. He wasn't cruel. That's what made it harder to understand. He held doors open. He remembered the smallest things I said. He spoke gently. But there was something in his presence, an impenetrability. A man who gave, but never gave himself away. There were moments I felt deeply connected to him, and others where I wondered if I knew him at all. He wasn't performative. He wasn't romantic in the way I'd been conditioned to expect. But he was real. And that terrified me more than any heartbreak ever had. I once tried to explain it to a friend. I said, he's like a mountain, still there, but unreachable. She laughed, said I sounded poetic. But I wasn't trying to be poetic. I was trying to make sense of the fact that this man existed in a way that didn't orbit around me. He didn't revolve. He didn't bend. He had gravity, yes, but not the kind that pulls. The kind that holds its place and lets you decide whether you'll climb or walk away. And I didn't know how to love that kind of man. There was a night when I asked him, "Why don't you ever try to impress me?" He paused, tilted his head, then said, "Because I don't need to convince you of something I already know." I stared at him, unsure whether to be offended or captivated. What did he know? That he was enough, that I'd stay, that he had value whether I saw it or not. It was the first time I realized he didn't derive his worth from being wanted. He didn't need my approval to feel complete. And that made him magnetic. The men I knew before him had edges molded by praise and approval. They softened where I wanted them to. They changed tones when I pouted. But he was carved by something older, something quieter. Discipline, restraint, depth. He had this unwavering self, respect that couldn't be bought, seduced, or guilted. And being near that made me feel both safe and exposed. Because I couldn't control it. I couldn't earn it. I could only witness it. And maybe, if I was willing, rise to meet it. There's a part of many women, we won't admit it out loud, that needs to know how far a man will go to keep us. I used that part of myself like a weapon. I became distant for no reason. I acted unimpressed. I flirted with detachment just to see if he'd chase. I wanted proof. Proof that he couldn't live without me. Proof that I mattered enough to break his composure. But with him, the more I pulled, the less he moved. And the more I needed his reaction, the more he made me confront my own. I remember one specific evening. I said something cutting, softly, calmly, the way women do when we're testing emotional boundaries. I watched him closely, searching for tension in his jaw, a flicker of pain in his eyes. But he didn't bite. He took a slow breath, looked at me, and said nothing. That silence was deafening. It made me furious. It made me scared. Not because he didn't care, but because he didn't need to respond. He wasn't playing. And that meant I couldn't win. At the time, I called it emotional distance. Now I see it was emotional mastery. He didn't reward bad behavior. He didn't play tug of war with affection. Most men, when tested, lean in too far or collapse completely. He did neither. He stayed in place, anchored. I didn't know how to handle that. I was used to controlling the rhythm of love, of tension, of repair. But with him, there was no performance. If I needed something real, I had to show up honestly. Otherwise, I'd be left dancing alone. The moment that changed everything came after one of my silent treatments. 2 days of cold distance, waiting for him to react. He didn't. Instead, he sent a short message. "I won't compete with your ego. When you're ready to talk as yourself, I'll listen." That line hit me like a mirror shattering. No anger, no neediness, just a quiet boundary drawn with surgical precision. And for the first time, I wasn't offended. I was ashamed. Because he hadn't rejected me, he'd rejected the game. I realized then this wasn't a man I could manipulate. This wasn't a man I could train with withdrawal, drama, or guilt. He didn't fear losing me, he feared losing himself. And that was the most disarming power of all, because it meant I couldn't scare him into loving me more. I couldn't punish him into submission. The only way to be with him was to stand as an equal, emotionally grounded, clear and honest. And I wasn't ready for that, not yet, but he always had been. There's a kind of silence that feels like abandonment, and another that feels like reflection. His was the second kind. When I cried, when I spiraled, when I tried to make him bleed with words, he didn't match my chaos. He listened. Not with eyes glazed in apathy, but with a focus that saw through the noise. He didn't rush to fix me. He didn't say it's okay just to end the discomfort. He let the space exist. And in that space, I felt exposed. Because without his reaction, I had to face my own pain. I used to think love meant comfort, that if someone truly cared, they'd absorb my emotions, shield me, make the sadness disappear. But he offered no shield. Instead, he offered presence, stillness, and that kind of presence was foreign. It didn't rush to soothe, it waited for truth. He never said, "Don't cry." He never begged me to calm down. He just stayed there, solid and undisturbed, like a mirror I couldn't crack. That silence, his refusal to collapse into my feelings, was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. There was a night I was overwhelmed, sobbing, pacing, unraveling. I told him, "I don't know what I need." He looked at me and said, "Then stop trying to escape it." It wasn't harsh, it was honest. He saw my pain, but didn't petty it. He didn't try to distract me with affection. He made space for it to live until I could understand it myself. That silence wasn't void, it was a form of trust. A trust that I was capable. A trust that I wasn't fragile. It felt merciless, it was mercy. Sometimes I wanted to scream at him, just to break that stillness, to see if he'd shatter, to prove he had a soft spot that looked like mine. But he didn't flinch, and slowly, I realized his silence wasn't resistance, it was boundaries. He knew where he ended and I began. He wouldn't let my emotions consume him, and he wouldn't let his love become a rescue mission. That shook me, because love, to me, had always meant merging. And with him I learned it could mean standing side by side, without losing yourself. He taught me something I didn't want to learn, that I'd been using emotional pain as a currency, that I'd relied on breakdowns to elicit closeness, that sometimes my sadness wasn't just felt, it was performed. But his silence didn't pay into that system. It waited. It invited something deeper. He wouldn't trade truth for peace. And because of that, I started to see myself clearly, not as a girl falling apart, but as a woman capable of facing the storm. And that terrified me more than the silence ever did. One morning, I looked in the mirror after another silent night, and the question hit me like a blow to the chest. Why do I keep trying to make him responsible for how I feel? It wasn't something he said. It was something he consistently refused to do. He never let my moods dictate his. He never took the bait of emotional spirals. He didn't withdraw, but he didn't rescue me either. And in that space where I expected him to change, I finally saw it wasn't him who needed to shift, it was me. I started to notice the patterns. Every time I felt insecure, I reached for him to stabilize me. Every time I doubted myself, I asked for his reassurance instead of building my own. I wanted him to prove he loved me again and again, to fill a void I had refused to face. And the more he resisted that role, the louder my need became. Until eventually, his resistance no longer felt like rejection, it felt like a mirror. I wasn't asking for love, I was asking for emotional dependence. And he wouldn't feed it. The hardest part wasn't seeing my own patterns. It was realizing how long I'd blamed men for not fixing me. I used to say they didn't try hard enough, didn't care deeply enough, weren't committed enough. But the truth, I had mistaken codependence for intimacy. I had confused validation with connection. And this man, stoic, grounded, immovable, showed me that real love doesn't dance to your wounds. It holds space for you to outgrow them. That wasn't the love I wanted, but it was the love I needed. Change didn't come in one epiphany. It came in small, quiet moments. The pause before I demanded a response. The decision to sit with my discomfort instead of outsourcing it. The choice to ask, "What am I feeling?" instead of "Why won't he fix this?" And he noticed. He never praised me for it. He wasn't the type. But his presence shifted. He leaned in a little more. Not because I became easier, but because I became honest. And for the first time, I didn't need his reaction to validate my effort. There was no dramatic turning point, just a slow, burning realization that I had been building my identity around being loved, not around loving myself. And when someone refused to bend to that illusion, I had called it coldness. But it wasn't, it was clarity. He gave me the gift of disappointment, not because he failed me, but because he refused to fulfill the fantasies I projected onto him. And in the ashes of those broken expectations, I found something I hadn't seen in years. My own center, my own weight, my own beginning. Most men I had dated made it clear, subtly or not, that they needed me, needed my attention, my softness, my approval. And I loved that. I thrived on being necessary. But him, he never once hinted that his world would collapse if I walked away. He never begged, never pleaded, never chased. And that quiet self-sufficiency haunted me. because it meant that if he stayed, it wasn't out of need, it was out of choice. And that, strangely, made me feel more seen than any desperate confession ever had. There's something terrifying about being with a man who doesn't need you. It strips away all illusions. It forces you to ask, if I'm not needed, then why am I here? But in time, that fear turned into freedom. I wasn't there to complete him. I wasn't a missing piece. I was simply a witness to his path, a path he would continue with or without me. And instead of trying to anchor him to me, I started wondering, what if I built a life he'd want to walk beside, not one that begged to be clung to? He once told me, I don't want a relationship that becomes my identity. I want one that sharpens it. At the time, I nodded, pretending to understand, but I didn't. I was still romanticizing enmeshment, still thinking love was about becoming everything to someone. But he lived differently. His days were full, with or without me. His joy didn't hinge on my mood. His worth didn't rise or fall based on my praise. And while that used to make me feel replaceable, it began to make me feel safe. It's strange, isn't it? How being needed can feel like love, but also like pressure. I used to think that a man's desperation was proof of his devotion. But now I saw it as something else, fear. Fear of being alone, of facing his own silence. But this man, he didn't fear solitude, he welcomed it. He returned to himself easily, and that taught me something invaluable, that being with someone who doesn't need you frees you to stop performing, to just be. To offer love not as a strategy, but as a gift. Sometimes I'd watch him sitting with a book, walking alone, lost in thought, and realize he belonged to himself entirely, and I envied that. Because I didn't. My identity had been tangled in relationships, reactions, the highs and lows of attention, but his peace was untouchable. And instead of resenting that, I started craving it for myself. Not to be like him, exactly, but to find what he had, that inner stillness that doesn't flinch, doesn't beg, doesn't break. The kind of strength that doesn't roar, it just remains. When I started looking back, really looking, I saw patterns I never wanted to admit. The manipulation masked as vulnerability, the silent punishments, the way I equated emotional chaos with passion. I thought I was being real, intense, deep, but truthfully I was immature. I confused his calm with indifference because I didn't understand stability. I was so used to men breaking down just to prove they loved me, that when one didn't, when one refused, I labeled it as coldness, but it was strength. There were moments I thought I was being romantic, dramatic in that cinematic way, the kind that made love feel alive. But what I was really doing was avoiding responsibility. I wanted to be felt, not understood, heard but not questioned. And any time he held up a mirror, gently, without judgment, I flinched, because I saw a woman who didn't know who she was without attention. And that was a harder truth to face than anything he ever said, because he never accused me. I just saw myself through his silence. It's humbling, realizing you were the chaotic one, that the love you thought was brave was just needy, that the fights you started weren't moments of emotional truth, but cries for control. And while he never called me out directly, he never gave those parts of me oxygen. He starved my performative tendencies without shaming me. And somehow, that taught me more than 1,000 arguments ever could. He didn't want to change me, but he wouldn't participate in my self-sabotage either. I used to think I was strong because I could feel deeply. But he taught me that strength isn't about feeling, it's about holding. Holding space, holding boundaries, holding your own pain without projecting it onto someone else. And when I saw how he lived, how he moved through the world with clarity, with quiet integrity, I realized how often I had been noisy just to feel significant. How often I had created tension just to avoid stillness. Stillness, I learned, was something you had to earn. Growth doesn't always look like action. Sometimes it looks like restraint, like choosing not to respond, like sitting with discomfort, like letting go of the need to be the most important person in someone's story. I used to demand center stage, but he showed me what it meant to hold space for both of us, to share the light, or even step out of it when necessary. And that shift in me didn't happen overnight. But it started the moment I stopped trying to win and started trying to understand myself mostly. I remember watching other women try to read him. They'd call him distant, unavailable, too in his head. They didn't get it. They mistook his stillness for emptiness, his discipline for boredom. They were used to noise, men who overshared, overpromised, overreacted. He didn't do any of that. He was present, but not performative. They couldn't feel him because he didn't try to be felt. But I knew there was depth there, just not the kind that demanded to be noticed. It required presence to perceive. One woman once asked me, "Don't you wish he was more expressive?" And I smiled, not because the question was wrong, but because it used to be mine. I used to think emotion had to look like eruption, tears, declarations, grand gestures. But his love was subtler. It lived in the way he listened, the way he remembered the smallest detail I dropped without thinking. It was the kind of love that didn't ask to be acknowledged, just expressed quietly, consistently. Not for applause, but for truth. People around us often assumed he didn't care, but they didn't see the way he noticed when I was tired before I said a word, the way he waited to speak until my emotions settled, the way he never interrupted, even in arguments. That wasn't coldness. That was respect. But in a world addicted to fast validation and loud affection, respect gets overlooked. It's invisible, and yet it's everything. I didn't see it at first either. But once I did, I couldn't unsee it. It changed the way I defined love. He was never the man who'd write poems or post tributes. He didn't text all day or flood my inbox with compliments. But he showed up when it mattered. He was early, not just on time. He checked the tires on my car without saying a word. He asked questions no one else thought to ask. He remembered the dates I forgot. And he never once said, "Look at what I'm doing for you." He just did it, quietly, as if it were normal. As if love didn't need to be announced, just practiced. I used to think I wanted fireworks. Now I understand I wanted a flame that didn't go out. And that was him, steady, warm, constant. Others saw an unlit sky and walked away. I saw the ember and stayed, because I realized some men burn bright and quick and disappear. But him, he was the kind of man who didn't need to prove his light. He simply carried it. And if you stayed long enough, sat still enough, you'd feel it too. But most people never sit still. I did. And because of that, truly, loving him required something I didn't expect: surrender. Not of self-worth, not of boundaries, but of ego. The part of me that needed to be right, to be worshipped, to be the center of every emotional scene. It couldn't survive around him, because he didn't feed it. He didn't play the roles I assigned. And so I had a choice: keep demanding a version of love shaped by my old wounds, or let go. Let go of the need to be adored, and instead learn how to be respected. That shift wasn't romantic, it was revolutionary. He never asked me to shrink, never told me to be less emotional or more composed. But being around him made me want to grow, not to please him, but to meet him where he stood. He had this quiet dignity that made tantrums feel childish, that made mind games feel embarrassing. He never said a word, but the contrast between my behavior and his presence was enough. Not judgment, just reflection. And that reflection pushed me to outgrow parts of myself I once thought were my personality. The ego hates discomfort. It wants immediate reassurance, visible power, constant attention, and I lived from that place for a long time. I mistook validation for connection. But with him, validation was never the currency. He gave presence, not performance. And that forced me to ask myself, what do I bring when I'm not being praised? Who am I when I'm not being chased? Without my usual tools, I felt stripped bare. But strangely, it didn't feel like weakness. It felt like the beginning of something true. There's a kind of love that wants to possess, to define, to label. I used to crave that kind. But his love moved differently. It didn't cling, it observed. It didn't command, it invited. And in that freedom, I found myself relaxing for the first time in years. Not because I had won him, but because I no longer needed to. There was no scoreboard, no emotional scoreboard to win. Just two people, standing side by side, sovereign but willing. That's the hardest kind of love to accept, and the most liberating one to give. I thought losing my ego would feel like disappearing, but instead it felt like emerging. Because underneath all the layers, the control, the fear, the performances, I found someone softer, quieter, more honest. And that version of me didn't need to provoke to feel powerful. She didn't need to be right to feel worthy. She could sit in silence, not to be punished, but to be present. And in that stillness, I met him. Not the fantasy, not the projection, but the man. And for once, I met myself too. He never tried to educate me. He never sat me down with lectures or lessons. And yet, I learned more from his stillness than from any book, any therapist, any past relationship. He never said, "This is how a strong person behaves." He simply behaved that way. His consistency was the curriculum. His presence was the teacher. The way he didn't react when provoked. The way he chose words with intention. The way he walked away from drama, not out of fear, but out of principle. I watched and I absorbed. There was something sacred in how he moved through the world. Unrushed, undistracted, unattached to noise. He didn't advertise his values, he lived them. I once asked him how he stayed so calm in the middle of conflict. He shrugged and said, "It's just not worth losing myself over." That sentence alone unlocked something in me. I realized how often I had lost myself just to be heard, just to be felt, just to be validated. But him, he knew that self-possession wasn't negotiable. That's what made him powerful. Most people teach by talking. He taught by being. The way he made decisions without asking for permission. The way he apologized only when it came from truth, not pressure. The way he held space for others without letting them invade his. Those moments became silent lessons I couldn't ignore. I started watching myself in contrast, how easily I broke my own rules, how much I relied on reaction over reflection. Slowly, I stopped trying to become the woman he wanted. I started becoming the woman I wanted. I began to mirror him, not in mimicry, but in energy. I started choosing silence over impulse. I paused before sending the dramatic text. I asked myself, is this from truth or from ego? These weren't things he ever told me to do. He never tried to shape me, but the version of me that existed around him, the version that emerged in his presence, was calmer, more grounded, less desperate. And I realized the right kind of man doesn't rescue you. He reflects you, and in that reflection, you begin to rescue yourself. Looking back, I can't pinpoint the day I changed. There was no sudden transformation, just a slow unraveling of the girl I used to be and the quiet emergence of a woman who no longer chased approval. A woman who understood that love without control is not weakness, but strength. He didn't teach me that with words. He lived it. And because he lived it, I learned it. Not through force, not through fear, but through example. Through presence, through the kind of masculinity that doesn't dominate, but inspires. If I could go back to the beginning, knowing what I know now, knowing the discomfort, the ego deaths, the unraveling, I'd still choose him. Not because it was easy, not because it made me feel like a queen, but because it woke me up. He didn't give me the fantasy, he gave me the mirror. And while there were days I hated what I saw, I kept looking. Because some part of me knew he wasn't here to save me. He was here to show me that I didn't need saving. I used to crave loud love, grand gesture, obsession dressed up as devotion, but he gave me something quieter, more difficult, more lasting. He gave me respect when I was being irrational, distance when I wanted attention, silence when I demanded chaos, and only now do I realize that was love too, just not the kind I knew how to receive back then. The kind that doesn't dance for you, but waits patiently until you're ready to sit down and listen. I'm listening now, fully. People often talk about the one that got away, but I don't think he got away. I think he walked exactly where he needed to, and I followed him as far as I was capable of going at the time. Maybe one day I'll follow further, maybe not. But what he gave me can't be undone. He left fingerprints on my thinking, on my way of being, on the way I now love, more slowly, more clearly, with less demand. And that's something no ending can erase. We don't talk now. There's a quiet respect between us, but no attempts to reopen the door. And strangely, that feels right, because what he gave me wasn't about him, it was about me. About what I learned in the shadow of his discipline. About the woman I met inside the silence he left behind. And I carry that with me, not as heartbreak, but as transformation. His love was a turning point, not soft, not sweet, but undeniably sacred. So yes, he never tried to make me happy. He never catered to my storms. He never let me hide behind drama. And for that, I grew, slowly, painfully, but completely. He wasn't a fairy tale. He was a mirror. And standing in front of it changed everything. Not because he tried to shape me, but because he refused to shrink for me. And if I ever meet someone like him again, I won't ask him to bend. I'll thank him for showing me how to stand.